My father tapped his glass before 100 guests. I expected a toast to my promotion, but instead, he handed me a leather portfolio. It was an invoice for $248,000 for a room and board. "You were a bad investment, Emma," he announced to the entire garden. "We're cutting our losses." Little did he know, in an hour, I'd hack his accounts and realize they'd been living on money stolen from me all along. The string quartet stopped mid-measure, the final notes of the cello fading into the crisp evening air of the Colorado foothills. My father, Arthur, tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon, silencing the 100 guests gathered across the manicured lawns of our estate. I stood near the rose garden, still feeling the hum of the server room in my bones, expecting a toast, perhaps even a backhanded mention of my promotion to lead analyst. Instead, he beckoned me forward and handed me a heavy, leather-bound portfolio. It wasn't a gift. I opened the cover to find a single, coldly professional document. It was an itemized invoice totaling $248,000. "Room, board, and inconvenience," Arthur announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back rows of white-clothed tables. "You've been a poor investment, Emma. Consider this our way of cutting losses." The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made the open mountain air feel thin. My mother, Eleanor, didn't flinch. She didn't rush to bridge the gap or offer a soft word to mask the cruelty of the theatre. She simply smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, took the microphone from Arthur, and handed it to my younger sister, Sophia. That passing of the torch told me everything I needed to know. Sophia stepped into the light, and the contrast between us was a physical blow. She wore a strapless silk piece that likely cost more than my annual rent, her hair a masterpiece of effortless waves, her skin glowing from a week at a spa in Sedona. I, meanwhile, was still wearing my charcoal work blazer and trousers, having driven straight from an emergency patch-up date to make it to the estate on time. It wasn't just a difference in style, it was a hierarchy. She was the asset. I was the overhead. "The keys, Emma," Sophia said, her voice amplified by the garden speakers. She didn't whisper it. She performed it. She held out a manicured hand, palm up, waiting. "Dad transferred the title to the family's true successor this morning. You know, someone who actually reflects the prestige of the name." I looked at her hand, then at the worn leather fob in my own. It wasn't a luxury car. It was a 5-year-old sedan I used for my commute into Denver, a car that saw me through long nights and early shifts. I had paid for the gas, the insurance, and every oil change since I was 21, but Arthur's name had remained on the title. I had viewed it as a formality, a relic of a time when I thought we were a family. I never realized ownership could be sharpened into a blade. I dropped the keys into her palm. The metal was cold, but Sophia's smile was colder. She closed her fingers around the fob as if she were crushing an insect. Finally, she breathed into the mic, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. Someone had to take out the trash. But they weren't finished. The dismantling of my life was only the first movement. Arthur gestured toward the shadows at the edge of the patio, summoning someone into the light. My stomach dropped as I recognized Robert, my department head. Robert was a man built of hollow promises, a middle manager who navigated corporate life by leaning toward whoever held the most gold. He looked at his polished Oxfords, then at Arthur, and finally at me. He looked deeply uncomfortable, yet perfectly obedient. "Robert," Arthur said, his voice booming with a terrifying, false warmth. "Why don't you share the news? We're all family here. Transparency is a virtue, after all." Robert cleared his throat. He didn't need the microphone. The garden was as silent as a tomb. "Emmer," he said, his voice thin and cracking. Based on certain character references provided by your parents this week and the significant financial liabilities they've brought to our attention, the firm feels you've become a security risk." He paused, swallowing hard, unable to meet my eyes. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Don't bother coming in on Monday. We'll have your personal belongings couriered to your apartment." The air left my lungs in a sharp, silent burst. This wasn't a birthday gone wrong or a typical family falling out. This was a calculated, strategic demolition. They hadn't just stopped loving me, they had decided to erase me. They wanted me jobless, stranded, and buried under a debt they had manufactured out of thin air. They wanted to strip me down to nothing so that I would have to crawl back and beg for the very crumbs they had just snatched away. I looked around the garden. The guests sat like statues in their tailored suits and designer pearls. No one moved. No one spoke. I was witnessing my own social execution, and they were all too polite, or perhaps too entertained, to look away. I stood alone on the manicured grass, the inverse weighing heavy in my bag while the empty space in my pocket, where my car keys used to be, felt like a physical burn. I looked at Arthur, who was beaming with a hunter's pride. I looked at Eleanor, who was casually examining her nails as if she were bored by the weather. I looked at Sophia, who was dangling my key ring on her index finger, watching the metal catch the light. In that moment, the shock fractured. It didn't break into sadness. It broke into something much harder, much sharper. It broke into clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. To me, emotion is just bad data in an audit. I deleted it. I looked Arthur straight in the eyes, adjusted the strap of my bag, and placed the leather portfolio inside. I turned around and walked out of the garden without uttering a single syllable. The gravel crunched under my sensible shoes, the only sound in a suffocating silence that stretched across the estate. The walk back to my apartment was 3 miles. It gave me time to think. It gave me time to feel the blisters forming on my heels and the cold reality settling in my chest. By the time I unlocked my door, the mountain air had turned biting, and the apartment smelled of stale coffee and the lingering scent of a life that had just been detonated. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to see the shadows to know how alone I was. I sat down at my desk and flipped open my laptop. I didn't go to a job board. I didn't update my resume. I opened a terminal window. The black screen and the blinking green cursor were the only things that felt honest. I am a cybersecurity analyst. My job is to find vulnerabilities, to trace breaches, and to understand exactly how systems fail. My family was a failing system. As I typed in the command lines, initializing search protocols I usually reserved for high-level corporate audits, I let myself think about that inverse. $248,000. It was a staggering number, precise, clinical, and cruel. But as I stared at the blinking cursor, I realized something vital. It wasn't just a bill. It was a confession. Healthy love isn't a ledger. You don't track the cost of milk or the price of school clothes unless you view your child as an asset that isn't performing. This is the transactional love trap. Narcissistic parents don't raise children, they manage investments. And when the investment doesn't yield the return they want, when the child doesn't marry into the right zip code, or become a trophy to display, or reflect their own glory back at them, they liquidate. They cut their losses. The inverse wasn't about money. It was about ownership. They were telling me that my very existence had a price tag, and since I wasn't paying dividends and social status, I was in default. They wanted to foreclose on my life. I thought about the times I had quietly paid the utility bills at the estate so the power wouldn't be cut before one of their gala parties. I remembered transferring funds from my modest savings while Sophia got another cosmetic procedure because, as Eleanor put it, confidence is the best accessory. I thought about the years I spent fixing their network, securing their private accounts, and cleaning up their digital messes, never asking for a dime. I realized then that they didn't hate me because I was a failure. They hated me because I was competent. They hated me because I didn't need them. For people like Arthur and Eleanor, independence is the ultimate insult. The code on my screen stopped scrolling. The search was complete. I took a deep breath and opened the first file. It was a bank statement, but it wasn't mine. It was theirs. And the numbers didn't add up. The silence in my apartment was heavy, but my phone was screaming. It vibrated against the desk surface like a trapped insect, buzzing with the fallout of their little garden performance. I didn't pick it up. I just watched the notification scroll down the lock screen, cataloguing the data of their assault. First came the gaslighting. A text from Eleanor. We just wanted you to see reality, Emma. Sometimes love looks like a hard lesson. Call us when you're ready to grow up. Then came the performance art. A notification told me Sophia had updated her profile. It was a selfie in the driver's seat of my sedan. She was pouting at the camera, the lighting perfectly adjusted to catch the glint of a tear I knew she'd summoned on command. Her caption was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood, speaking of the pain of cutting off toxic family members to protect her peace. Finally, the threat arrived. An email from Arthur. The subject line read, Repayment Schedule. The body was brief. If you do not set up a payment plan for the $248,000 by Friday, we will pursue legal action for theft of services. Do not test me. They expected me to be reading these through a veil of tears. They expected me to be typing out frantic, apologetic paragraphs, begging for forgiveness and promising to pay whatever they asked just to be let back into the fold. They were betting on the version of me they had constructed in their heads, the weak, dependent daughter who needed their validation to breathe. But they had forgotten what I actually do for a living. I don't deal in drama. I deal in threat assessment and mitigation. I swiped the notifications away, archiving them into a secure folder. I didn't block them. In my line of work, you never block a source of intelligence, you just mute the noise and monitor the signal. I turned back to my laptop. The forensic search on their finances was running in the background, a progress bar inching toward completion. While that cooked, I had another fire to put out, my career. Robert, my now former boss, was the weak link in the corporate chain. He had fired me based on hearsay to impress a man in a tuxedo, which was a catastrophic tactical error. I didn't call Robert. You don't negotiate with a compromised node, you bypass it. I opened my secure contact list and found the direct line for Sarah Miller, the regional director. Last year, when a ransomware attack threatened to encrypt our entire Western Division's database, I was the one who found the breach. I was the one who stayed up for 72 hours straight to patch the vulnerability while Robert was coordinating from a golf course in Scottsdale. Sarah knew my name. More importantly, she knew my value. I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. Emma. Her voice was sharp, laced with surprise. It's nearly midnight. Is the server down? The network is secure, Sarah, I said, keeping my voice flat and professional. But my employment status isn't. I'm calling to inform you that as of 2 hours ago, I was terminated by Robert. Terminated? On what grounds? He attended a private party hosted by my parents. Based on a personal dispute regarding family finances, he decided I was a security risk. There was no HR presence, no performance review, and no exit interview. Just a public dismissal in front of 100 socialites. There was a silence on the line. It was the silence of a woman who understood the crushing weight of corporate liability. He fired a lead analyst at a cocktail party based on personal gossip? She asked. Yes. I'm calling to clarify if this is the new protocol for personnel management. Because if it is, I need to know where to mail my badge. Give me 5 minutes, she said. The line went dead. I didn't stare at the phone. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. I poured a cup, black, and returned to the desk. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, my personal email pinged. It was an automated notification from the corporate system. Access restored. Then a second email arrived, this one directly from Sarah. Robert had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation into professional misconduct. My termination was voided. I was reinstated effective immediately with a 10% retention adjustment to my salary to account for the clerical error. Take Monday off, the email concluded. We'll talk Tuesday. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, but it tasted like victory. The first pillar of their control had just crumbled. They thought they had stripped me of my livelihood, leaving me destitute and desperate. Instead, they had just handed me a raise and removed the only incompetent manager standing in my way. I looked back at the terminal window. The progress bar hit 100%. The data from my parents' financial history was ready. I cracked my knuckles and leaned in. If they thought losing my job was going to break me, they had no idea what was about to happen when I looked inside their bank accounts. The spreadsheet on my screen was a map of moral decay. I wasn't looking at a family's budget. I was looking at a crime scene. I started with the car, the sedan Sophia had so gleefully reclaimed in the garden. Arthur had claimed he owned the title. He lied. I traced the VIN through the state database and cross-referenced it with the bank records I had just decrypted. The initial purchase didn't come from Arthur's personal account. It came from an account ending in 4092. I queried the account origin. It was a trust, the Margaret Trust. My grandmother. She had died 10 years ago, and I was told she had left nothing but old jewelry and memories. But here it was, a trust fund established in my name, meant to mature when I turned 21. The balance should have been substantial. It was currently 0. Arthur hadn't bought that car for me out of the goodness of his heart. He had bought it with my own inheritance, put his name on the title, and then loaned it to me to keep me grateful. And now, he had given my stolen property to Sophia as a reward for her loyalty. Arthur hadn't bought that car for me out of the goodness of his heart. He had bought it with my own inheritance, placed his name on the title, and then effectively leased my own life back to me to ensure I remained grateful. Now, he had handed my stolen property to Sophia as a trophy for her loyalty. But that was merely petty theft. The real anomaly lay hidden within the investment folders. For years, my parents had postured as sophisticated wealth managers, handling the portfolios of family members who lacked financial literacy. I pulled up the records for Uncle David and Aunt Mary. They were kind, trusting people who had worked hard for every cent they owned. For 5 years, they had been transferring $5,000 a month to Arthur, believing it was being placed into a high-yield technology fund. I followed the digital breadcrumbs. The transfers hit Arthur's holding account, sat there for precisely 24 hours, and were then wired out. The money didn't go to a brokerage or a hedge fund. It was funneled into an account labeled SC Lifestyle LLC. Sophia Eleanor. I dug into the LLC details. It was a classic shell company, a parasitic entity used to pay off staggering credit card balances, lease luxury SUVs, and fund influencer-style excursions to Tulum and the Amalfi Coast. Uncle David wasn't investing in his retirement. He was unwittingly subsidizing Sophia's designer wardrobe and first-class tickets. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitor the only thing cutting through the darkness of my apartment. This wasn't just a failure of character. This was a felony. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the missing money. It was the authorization. On every withdrawal slip from the shell company, right next to Arthur's jagged, arrogant scrawl, was a second signature, fluid, practiced, and unmistakable. Sophia's. This is the reality of the golden child's debt. They often plead ignorance, claiming to be passive recipients of a parent's unexplained generosity. They say they didn't know where the money came from, they just spent what was given. It is a convenient, practiced lie. But willful ignorance is not innocence, it is a strategy. Sophia wasn't a bystander. The digital logs proved she was an active accomplice, signing off on the theft from our own aunt and uncle to maintain her hollowed-out version of a glamorous life. I backed up every file to an encrypted drive. The inverse they had handed me in the garden was a theatrical performance, but this data was a subpoena. I composed an email, attaching a single PDF titled The Cost of Doing Business. I addressed it to Arthur, Eleanor, Sophia, and the victims, Uncle David and Aunt Mary. I didn't include a message. I didn't need to. I hit send, then immediately disconnected my phone and my router. Silence is the one thing a narcissist cannot endure. By refusing to engage in the inevitable explosion of drama, I starved them of the reaction they required to survive. I slept soundly for the first time in years while they descended into a panic I no longer had to witness. When I reconnected the next morning, my phone was a graveyard of threats and frantic demands. But one voicemail stood out. It was Uncle David. He didn't sound angry, he sounded weary but relieved. You didn't destroy the family, Emma, he said. You just turned on the lights. I'm calling my attorney. Days later, Arthur pounded on my apartment door. He looked smaller, his expensive suit rumpled, begging me to retract the email to save him from a federal investigation. We did it for the family legacy, he pleaded through the heavy wood of the door. Think of the name. You didn't give me a legacy, I replied through the chain lock. You gave me an inverse. I slid a printed copy of the federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud through the narrow crack of the door. You wanted to teach me the cost of living, I said. This is the cost of lying. I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. The collapse was swift and absolute. The estate was seized to pay restitution to the family members they had defrauded. Sophia's curated life evaporated overnight as her sponsors fled the scandal, eventually forcing her into a retail position at a suburban mall to make ends meet. 2 weeks later, I sat at my desk in the quiet of my home. The war was over. I moved my cursor to the folder labeled Family Audit and hit delete. For 26 years, I had carried a debt that was never mine to pay. Now, the ledger was balanced. I looked out the window at the mountains, finally seeing the horizon clearly. Zero debt. Zero guilt. Zero regrets.